Hello, chess lovers, and welcome to Chess Insight. This time we will be talking about the King's Gambit, one of the most popular classical openings of the 16th century. For this material, I have prepared a few games from Gioachino Greco, better known simply as Greco. Greco was an Italian chess player who lived in the 17th century. He was known as one of the strongest players of his time, and so legendary that many variations of openings and defenses were named after him. We have the Greco defense, the Greco counter gambit, the bishop's opening with the Greco gambit, and even Greco's attack. Let's begin with a game played around the year 1620. Greco's opponent was not recorded, so it was written simply as NN, or no name. The game started with the white pawn moving to e4, and black replied with the pawn to e5. White then pushed the pawn to f4, which is the characteristic move of the King's Gambit. Black accepted the gambit by capturing the pawn on f4. It is called the King's Gambit because the pawn in front of the king is sacrificed in order to open the way for a quick attack against the opponent's king. Greco then developed his bishop to c4. However, this move allowed black to bring the queen to h4 with check. White could not block with the pawn to g3 because after that the black pawn could capture on g3 and the white rook in the corner on h1 would be lost. So Greco chose to move his king directly to f1. Black continued by developing the bishop to c5, threatening checkmate on f2. White responded with the pawn to d4, and when the black bishop retreated to b6, Greco developed the knight to f3. Here, black made a mistake by moving the queen to g4. Greco immediately punished this with a tactical combination. The white bishop captured the pawn on f7 with check. When the black king took the bishop, the white knight jumped to e5, giving check while also attacking the queen on g4. After the king retreated to f8, the white knight captured the queen on g4, and the black position collapsed. At this point, the opponent resigned. In only 9 moves, Greco had won a quick victory. From this game, we can already see the character of the King's Gambit, sacrificing a pawn to open direct attacking lines against the enemy king. In another game, also played in the same year, the play lasted longer, around 23 moves. Once again, the game began with the pawn to e4, black replied with the pawn to e5, and then white pushed the pawn to f4. Black captured on f4, and this time Greco chose to develop the knight to f3. With the knight on f3, white prevents black from giving an early check with the queen to h4. Black then advanced the pawn to g5, and white continued by developing the bishop to c4. The combination of the knight on f3 and the bishop on c4 is very typical in the King's Gambit, because together they directly target the weak point on f7. Black tried to play more aggressively by pushing the pawn to g4, but this move only opened the door for white to launch a sharp attack. Greco immediately sacrificed the bishop by capturing the pawn on f7 with check. The black king was forced to capture the bishop, but Greco quickly jumped with the knight to e5, once again giving check. The black king stepped to e6. Then Greco brought his queen into play by capturing the pawn on g4, again with check. The king avoided the threat by capturing the knight on e5. At this moment, white had already given up 2 pieces, but the compensation was clear. The black king had been lured out of safety and was now standing in a dangerous position, closer and closer to checkmate. Greco did not stop pressing. He checked again by moving his queen to f5. The black king stepped to d6, and white pushed the pawn to d4. With this move, Greco realized that the queen and pawn alone were not enough for the attack, so he opened the diagonal for the bishop on c1 to join the offensive. Black tried to defend by developing the bishop to g7, but Greco immediately struck back with his bishop capturing the pawn on f4 with check. The king stepped back to e7, but Greco kept the pressure, following with another check by moving the bishop to g5. Black tried to block with a bishop, but Greco pushed the pawn to e5, attacking the black bishop on f6. Black decided to trade bishops by capturing the white bishop on g5, but Greco recaptured immediately with his queen, once again giving check. The king retreated to e8, but the pressure was not over. The white queen moved to h5 with check again. The king dodged to e7. At this moment, Greco castled. But the purpose was not only king's safety, it was also to activate the rook on f1 so that it could join the attack. Now there was a deadly threat. The white queen was ready to land on f7 for checkmate. Black tried to prevent this with the queen to e8, but Greco found the way. The queen returned to g5 with check. The king stepped to e6, and the white rook swung to f6, once more giving check and forcing black to capture the rook with the knight. Greco had no hesitation. His queen captured the knight, giving check again. The black king stepped to d5. At this point, Greco had already sacrificed much material, but all of it was to open the path for an unstoppable attack. He continued with the knight to c3, checking again. The king captured the pawn on d4, but Greco was ready with the next blow, the queen to f4 with check. The king stepped back to c5. Now the forced sequence leading to checkmate began. White pushed the pawn to b4. The king stepped to c6. The queen rose to c4 with check, the king to b6, and finally the knight jumped to a4, sealing the game with a beautiful checkmate. This game clearly shows that the king's gambit is not merely about sacrificing a pawn. The most important thing is the attacking initiative. As long as white keeps pressing, the opponent has no time to breathe, let alone organize a defense. Let's move on to the next game, also played by Greco. The game opened with the white pawn to e4, and black replied with the pawn to e5. White immediately played the pawn to f4, and black captured it with the e5 pawn. From here, white developed the knight to f3, while black tried to be aggressive with the pawn to g5. Greco was not afraid. He immediately activated his bishop to c4. As I explained before, the combination of the knight on f3 and the bishop on c4 is the hallmark of the king's gambit, both aiming directly at the weak point on f7, the center of the black king's defense. Black then developed the bishop to g7, and Greco responded with the pawn to d4. Black opened the diagonal for his bishop with the pawn to d6, and white brought another knight into play by jumping to c3. It is worth noting, in the opening it is very important to develop the pieces quickly. The more pieces that are active, the more resources you have for attack, so the pressure does not rely only on one or two pieces, but is supported by the whole army. Black continued with the pawn to c6, while white pushed the pawn to h4. The purpose of this h4 push is clear, to open a path toward f7. If black captures the pawn on h4, white can respond with the bishop taking on f4, or the knight capturing the pawn on g5 to add pressure. But here black tried to protect the pawn on g5 by playing h6, a move that actually created a weakness. Greco immediately struck by capturing the pawn on g5 with his h4 pawn. Black recaptured with a pawn, and then white captured the black rook. Black struck back by taking with the bishop. After this, Greco sacrificed his knight by jumping to e5. Black accepted the sacrifice and captured the knight with his pawn from d6. But Greco had already prepared the continuation. The white queen advanced to h5, a dangerous move that threatened two things at once: checkmate on f7 and pressure against the bishop on h8. To defend, black brought the queen to f6, guarding both critical points. But Greco kept up the pressure. He captured the pawn on e5 with his own pawn, attacking the black queen and forcing it to retreat to g7 in order to keep guarding f7 and the bishop on h8. From this position, white kept applying pressure. The white pawn advanced again to e6. Black developed the knight to f6 and attacked the white queen. White captured the pawn on f7 with check, forcing the black king to move to f8. At this point, Greco seemed to pose a challenge. What is the strongest continuation here? Take a moment to think. The best move played was the bishop capturing the pawn on f4. The purpose is clear. If the black knight tries to capture the queen on h5, white can simply close with the bishop to d6, and that leads directly to checkmate. This is exactly what happened in Greco's game. With this combination, he ended the game in only 16 moves. Even if the bishop on f4 were captured by a pawn, Greco still had a winning path. White could move the queen to c5, which also leads to an immediate checkmate. So all of these attacks were not coincidences. They were built with calculation. The early pawn sacrifice, quick piece development, and then the powerful combination of queen and bishop constantly pressing the opponent's king. This game truly emphasizes the aggressive nature of the king's gambit. For anyone interested in learning this opening, you should make sure your playing style fits. If you like attacking, pressing from the very beginning, and are not afraid to take risks, then the King's Gambit can be a deadly weapon. Now let us move on to the next game, once again showing how aggressive Greco was in playing the King's Gambit. The game began with the white pawn to e4. Black replied with the pawn to e5. Greco immediately played the pawn to f4, which was captured by the black pawn on e5. White developed the knight to f3, while black chose a move not often seen in Greco's games before, the knight to e7. Greco pushed with the pawn to h4, and black tried to hold with the pawn to h5. White then activated the bishop to c4. It is worth noting that the combination of the knight on f3, the bishop on c4, and the pawn on h4 is a very typical pattern in the King's Gambit. Usually the knight on f3 has flexibility. It can jump to e5 or g5 depending on the situation. Black continued with the knight to g6, and Greco immediately sent his knight to g5, directly targeting the weak spot on f7. Black tried to defend with the knight to e5. The white bishop retreated to b3, then black pushed the pawn to f6, attacking the bishop. The white knight stepped back to h3, black rerouted the knight to g6, and white strengthened the center with the pawn to d4. This move was very important, because besides controlling the center, the pawn on d4 opened the way for the bishop on c1 to join the attack. Black tried to exchange by having the knight capture the pawn on h4, but Greco replied with his knight capturing the pawn on f4. Black pushed the pawn to g5 again, attacking the knight, and here Greco began to sacrifice material quality. The white rook captured the knight on h4. When black recaptured with the pawn, Greco played the knight to g6, attacking the rook, forcing black to move the rook to h7, which also had to protect the pawn on h5 so it would not be taken by the queen. But the black position was already fragile. White pressed further with the bishop to g8, forcing the black rook to g7. Then the white queen calmly entered by capturing the pawn on h5. Now the threats against the black king became very serious. Black tried to defend by having the rook capture the bishop on g8, but Greco was ready with the continuation. He moved the knight to e5, creating a mating net that was very difficult to escape. The black king was forced to move to e7. Even if the rook came to g6, it would only delay the end by one move. Greco finished the attack with a brilliant combination. The queen to f7 with check. The black king ran to d6. The knight jumped to c4 with another check, and the black king had no choice but to step into the net by going to c4. The final move was a beautiful checkmate on d5. This game once again showed Greco's brilliance. Every move was planned, from the pawn sacrifice, rapid piece development, to the exchange sacrifice just to open attacking lines. The end result was an unavoidable checkmate. From all the games played by Greco, we can see one main characteristic of the King's Gambit, an aggressive style full of sacrifices. White is willing to give up material as long as it opens attacking paths to the enemy king. In Greco's era, this strategy was very effective, because many of his opponents did not yet understand the defensive theory against the King's Gambit. But in the modern era, the King's Gambit is rarely played at the elite level because opening theory has developed so far. Many black players choose not to accept the gambit, or if they do, they quickly return the pawn to reach a safe position. Even so, the King's Gambit remains fascinating to study, especially for players who love to attack and are not afraid to take risks. From Greco's games, we can learn how to build an attack, sacrifice material at the right moment, and maintain the initiative all the way to the end. That's all for today's discussion of the King's Gambit. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.